It was a quiet afternoon when something unusual happened, a small, unnoticed shift that would set everything into motion. The kind of thing people usually overlook. But to the one paying attention, it felt like the first crack in an otherwise smooth surface. A slip-up that meant something deeper, something that would unfold into a truth nobody expected. For months, things had been running the same way at the busy downtown cafe. The staff worked tirelessly, greeting customers, making orders, and exchanging pleasantries, their faces a blur of familiar routine. Everything seemed as it should be on the outside. But not for long. There was a shift that day. One of the regular workers, who had always been calm and diligent, started to look more stressed than usual. She kept casting nervous glances at the back office door whenever the manager walked past. Normally, she would have smiled and carried on, but today she was distracted. Was it just a bad day? Maybe. But the way she carefully tucked her earnings into her apron, almost like she was hiding something, struck a chord. It didn't sit right. The manager, a man known for his charm and quick wit, had been a fixture at the cafe for years. His reputation was stellar, his control over the workers unquestioned. He was seen as someone who could handle any situation with ease, someone who took charge when things got tough. The kind of manager everyone trusted. But that trust was about to be tested. From the corner of the room, an observer, someone who had been watching the manager for a while now, felt the discomfort building. The manager seemed to be moving faster than usual today, sneaking quick glances at the workers as if he was making sure no one noticed him. And that's when it happened. Just for a brief moment, the manager paused and glanced at the register, a look in his eyes that was sharper than anyone had ever seen. There it was, the first crack. It wasn't about what he did, but about how he did it. A simple act, unnoticed by the busy workers, but to an observant eye, it was clear. He had been pocketing tips. Not all of them, but enough to make a difference. And this wasn't just an accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. No, this was deliberate. The manager was taking what didn't belong to him, keeping it hidden, tucked away. The workers didn't know, and the customers didn't know. But someone had seen it. This wasn't just about a few dollars. It was about something bigger, the abuse of power, the manipulation of trust. As the day went on, the small cracks began to multiply. The nervousness of the workers, the manager's hurried glances, the strange actions, all added up to something much darker than anyone could have guessed. And there it was, the beginning of the end. The discovery of this hidden truth would change everything. It would force someone to step forward, to act. But for now, the secret was out. What would happen next? The question hung in the air. What would the observer do with this knowledge? And what would the manager do when he realized someone knew the truth? The tension grew thick, and the story was just beginning. The discovery weighed heavily on the observer's mind. That one fleeting moment, when the manager had hesitated by the register, was enough to plant a seed of doubt. It wasn't just a slip-up, it was calculated. But what could they do with this knowledge? Confronting the manager directly seemed too risky, and the workers had no idea what was really going on. No one had even noticed the small thefts, the handful of tips disappearing into the manager's pockets. But the observer couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next few days were tense. The manager carried on as usual, all smiles and charm, running the cafe with his usual authority. Yet, there was a noticeable change in his behavior. He seemed more watchful, almost as if he was aware that someone was watching him. The observer noticed the little things, the way he moved, the way his eyes flickered to the cash register more frequently, the way he made sure no one was looking before making small gestures that felt like red flags. There was no mistaking it, the manager was being extra careful. But it wasn't just the manager. The workers, too, were acting differently. The quiet worker who had hidden her tips was now nervous. She would glance over at the manager, sometimes catching his eyes with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. It was almost as if she knew the truth, but couldn't bring herself to speak up. The others seemed oblivious, going about their work as usual. They didn't notice the subtle tension that had crept into the cafe. They didn't notice how the atmosphere had shifted. The observer began to pay closer attention. Every time the manager was around, the unease among the workers grew. A few of them were whispering during breaks, sharing quick glances as they exchanged unspoken thoughts. It was clear that the workers didn't trust the manager as much as they once had, but they couldn't put their finger on why. There was no concrete proof, just an uncomfortable feeling that lingered in the air. The manager had always been the one to settle disputes, to smooth things over when someone felt slighted. But lately, he'd been snapping at the workers more often, his temper flaring up over the smallest issues. When he wasn't at the register, he was in the back office, his door closed. Whenever he did come out, he seemed unusually distant, like he was hiding something. He would check his watch, his eyes darting to the front door, as if waiting for something. The observer, now fully engrossed in this strange web, couldn't let it go. They needed more proof, something that could confirm the suspicions. The tension was growing, and it was starting to feel like something was going to break soon. The more the observer watched, the more it seemed like the manager was pushing the boundaries, testing how far he could go without being caught. But what was the manager hiding? And why was he acting like this? The observer couldn't get the answers just by watching. They would need to dig deeper. Each day brought more pieces to the puzzle. The workers had no idea what was coming, but the tension was building to a breaking point. The manager's actions were too strange to ignore, and the observer knew they couldn't just sit back and let it all play out. Something had to be done. But what? The clock was ticking, the observer knew that something had to be done. They couldn't stand by and watch the manager get away with this any longer. But gathering proof without raising suspicion was going to be tricky. It wasn't like the manager was openly taking money from the workers. No, he was too clever for that, he was careful, almost methodical in his actions. But there was something that didn't sit right, and the observer couldn't shake the feeling that if they could just catch the manager in the act, everything would fall into place. The first step was to watch him closely, to follow him without him noticing. The manager often disappeared into the back office during his shifts, and the observer began to notice patterns in his behavior. Every time the cafe got busy, he would retreat to his office, leaving the workers to manage the rush. But it wasn't just the rush that made him retreat. Whenever tips were being counted, he seemed to find a reason to leave the room, only to return moments later with an air of nonchalance, as if nothing had happened. It was almost as though he was trying to avoid being seen. The observer began to track the manager's movements more closely. They started timing when the manager disappeared and for how long. The more they watched, the more certain they became that something was off. It was clear now that he was intentionally avoiding being around when the tips were counted. But why? What was he doing during those moments? What was he hiding? One evening, after the cafe had closed and the workers were busy cleaning up, the observer decided to take a risk. They snuck into the manager's office while he was distracted with a phone call. The office, tucked away in the back corner of the cafe, was usually off-limits to the staff, but tonight the door was slightly ajar. The observer took a deep breath and stepped inside. The office was tidy, just as expected. Papers were neatly stacked on the desk, and the only sign of life was a half-empty cup of coffee by the computer. But as the observer scanned the room, their eyes landed on a small drawer near the desk. It was slightly open, and the observer couldn't resist taking a look inside. What they found shocked them. Tucked inside the drawer was a thick envelope, filled with cash, far more than the typical tips that the workers earned. The envelope had been carefully sealed, as if it were meant to be hidden, not just forgotten. The observer's heart raced. This was the proof they had been looking for. It wasn't just a few dollars here and there, this was a significant amount of money that didn't belong to the manager. But as the observer held the envelope in their hands, a rush of uncertainty washed over them. What if the manager found out? What if this was just a mistake? The observer hesitated, torn between the need to expose the truth and the fear of getting caught. But there was no turning back now. They had the evidence. And they knew they couldn't let it go. As the manager finished his phone call and began to move towards the office, the observer quickly slipped the envelope back into the drawer, their heart pounding in their chest. They had what they needed, but now came the hard part: what would they do with it? The next morning, as the cafe filled with the usual bustle of morning coffee and breakfast orders, the observer couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. They had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The manager had no idea that the observer knew his secret, and the workers were still blissfully unaware. But how long would this last? The moment the envelope had slipped back into the manager's desk, the weight of what the observer had just done settled over them like a heavy fog. They had the evidence they needed, proof that the manager was stealing tips from hard-working employees. But there was more to it than just catching him red-handed. The truth was far more complicated and sinister than they had initially realized. The following days dragged on, with the observer carefully weighing their options. They could confront the manager, but they knew that would be risky. If the manager denied everything, the observer would have no way to prove what they had seen. The only option left was to find a way to expose the manager without directly confronting him. But how? The observer spent more time watching the manager closely. They noticed that his behavior had become even more erratic in the past week. He was more defensive than usual, barking at employees over minor issues, and avoiding eye contact when questioned about anything. It was as if he could sense that something was amiss, but he didn't know exactly what. The observer knew it was only a matter of time before his carefully crafted facade would start to crack. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. The cafe had been particularly busy, with a rush of customers pouring in for their lunch breaks. As usual, the manager disappeared into his office just as the tip jar was being counted. But this time, the observer was ready. They followed the manager quietly as he retreated into the back, and instead of simply waiting for him to leave the room, they decided to take a different approach. They waited. They watched as the manager glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was paying attention, and then, with swift hands, he reached into the tip jar. In a move so quick it almost seemed rehearsed, he took a small handful of bills and shoved them into his pocket. He paused for a moment, checking the room once more, before quickly returning to his office. The observer's heart pounded in their chest. This was it. They had seen it with their own eyes now. There was no denying it. The manager wasn't just stealing from the workers, he was doing it right under their noses, with no regard for the consequences. The tip jar wasn't just a casual afterthought for him, it was a source of steady income, a secret slush fund he had been pilfering from for months. But this wasn't just about a few dollars. The more the observer thought about it, the more they realized that the manager's actions had a ripple effect. He wasn't just stealing money, he was betraying the trust of everyone who worked there. The workers depended on their tips to make ends meet, and by taking that money, the manager had undermined their livelihoods. It became clear to the observer that the truth wasn't just about exposing the theft, it was about revealing the kind of person the manager really was. Someone who, despite his charm and authority, lacked integrity and empathy for the people who made the cafe run. His greed wasn't just a weakness, it was a fundamental flaw in his character. And the observer knew they couldn't let this go on any longer. But now the question was, how could they prove it? The manager had been careful, always ensuring that no one could catch him in the act. The tip jar was often handled by several people, making it difficult to trace the thefts to him directly. The observer realized that they would need something more concrete, something that would tie the manager to the crime in a way that couldn't be denied. The plan was risky, but it was the only way forward. The observer decided to take a step that would push the boundaries of what they had done before, something that could finally expose the manager for who he really was. But the risks were high. If the manager found out, there could be serious consequences. The stakes had never been higher, and the observer was about to take the final step in uncovering the truth. The weight of the decision hung heavily on the observer's shoulders. The time had come. There was no turning back now. They had the evidence, they had seen the manager's actions firsthand, and now it was time to confront the man who had been stealing from the hardworking employees. But the plan wasn't simple. It wasn't just about confronting the manager, it was about getting him to admit his wrongdoings without making it seem like an accusation. The observer knew that one wrong move could ruin everything. It was late in the afternoon when the cafe was quieter, the rush of customers had slowed, and only a few workers remained behind to clean up. The manager was in his office, as usual, his door slightly ajar. The observer stood at the counter, watching him through the open door. They could see the manager's back as he sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break. With a deep breath, the observer walked toward the office. Each step felt heavier than the last. As they approached, they felt their heart race, knowing that this moment could change everything. The plan was simple: walk in, act casual, and start a conversation. No accusations, no direct confrontation, just a way to get him to reveal what he had been doing. The observer knocked gently on the door. The manager looked up, startled, and gave a half-smile, the kind he always used when someone caught him off guard. "Hey, you need something?" he asked, his voice friendly but distant. The observer hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I just wanted to ask you about something. It's been bothering me a bit." The manager leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Sure, what's on your mind?" The casual tone made the observer feel even more anxious, but they pushed forward. "Well, I've noticed a few things lately, small things, you know." They let the words hang in the air, hoping that the manager would take the bait and ask what they meant. The manager raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Like what?" The observer kept their voice steady, not giving away too much. "It's nothing major, just that sometimes it seems like the tip jar isn't adding up the way it should be." The manager's face stiffened, but he quickly masked it with a chuckle. "Ah, I'm sure it's just the usual mix-up. You know how it is with cash, people can get confused with the change and all that." The observer nodded slowly, pretending to buy into the explanation. "Yeah, I suppose. But it's just that I've noticed a few patterns. Like when you're away from the register, I've seen the tips get a little light. Sometimes more than they should be." The manager's eyes narrowed slightly, but he quickly recovered. He stood up from his chair, walking over to the window as if thinking. The tension in the room was palpable now, the air thick with unsaid words. "It's nothing to worry about," the manager said, his voice a little colder. "People miscount, or maybe someone else is taking the tips by accident." The observer didn't back down. "Maybe. But I've been paying close attention, and it seems like you've been the one handling the jar when it happens. I'm just trying to figure out what's really going on here." The manager's eyes flashed with irritation, but his face remained calm. He walked back to his desk and sat down slowly, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. The observer could feel the tension rising between them, and they knew this was the moment where the truth had to come out. "So, what are you trying to say?" the manager asked, his voice tight with barely contained anger. The observer took a deep breath. "I'm saying that I've seen you take tips. More than once. And I have proof." The manager froze, his hands clenching into fists on the desk. He stared at the observer for a moment, as if weighing his options. The silence in the room was thick, the weight of the accusation hanging heavy in the air. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice shaking slightly, though he tried to mask it. You're making a big mistake. But the observer had the proof. They didn't need the manager's confession, just the truth that had already been uncovered. The envelope of cash, the careful moments when the manager thought no one was watching. It was all there. And now, it was up to the observer to make sure the truth didn't stay hidden any longer. I don't think I'm mistaken, the observer said calmly. And if you don't come clean, I'm going to make sure the others find out too. The manager's face twisted with frustration and guilt. He was trapped, and he knew it. But he wasn't about to give up without a fight. You don't know what you're dealing with, he spat, his anger rising. You have no idea who you're talking to. The observer stood firm. Maybe. But I know what's right. And what you've been doing isn't right. For a moment, the two stared at each other, the room thick with tension. The manager finally slumped back into his chair, his eyes lowered. It was clear he had been caught, and there was no way out. The silence between the two seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The manager, who had been so confident just moments before, was now deflated, the bravado he'd carried for so long melting away. He slumped in his chair, his hands resting on the desk as if the weight of his actions had finally hit him. He had been caught. There was no escaping it now. The observer stood still, watching the manager carefully. They had expected this moment, but nothing could have prepared them for the sudden realization that the truth had been exposed. The manager's guilt wasn't just about the stolen tips, it was about everything he had hidden, everything he had manipulated. And now, the facade he had carefully crafted over the years was coming apart piece by piece. I know what you've been doing, the observer said quietly, but their voice was firm, unwavering. It's not just the tips. It's the way you've taken advantage of everyone here, those people who trust you. The workers who rely on their tips to get by. The manager didn't respond immediately. His eyes were cast downward, and for a moment, he seemed to wrestle with his emotions. He knew what had to be said, but pride held him back. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the choices he had made, the kind of person he had become. Do you think I wanted to do this? The manager finally spoke, his voice low, almost regretful. Do you think I enjoyed stealing from my own employees? The observer didn't flinch. They had heard enough. No, but you did it. And you did it over and over again. You took advantage of people who worked hard just to survive, and for what? Your own gain. For your own selfishness. The manager's face hardened, his lips curling into a bitter smile. You think I'm the only one who's been struggling around here? I've been trying to keep this place afloat. The company's barely hanging on, and the workers, they don't understand the pressure I'm under. They don't understand what it's like to make hard decisions. The observer shook their head slowly. That doesn't justify what you've done. You've used your power to control and manipulate. And that's not a mistake, that's a choice. A bad one. The room felt colder now. The tension was palpable, and the observer could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The manager's words, however, were beginning to feel hollow. He wasn't just defending himself, he was making excuses for his actions, trying to justify the betrayal he had orchestrated. And the more he spoke, the clearer it became, this wasn't about struggling to keep the business alive. This was about greed, about taking what didn't belong to him, and about using his position to do it. The observer glanced down at the desk, where the envelope of cash had been earlier. The same envelope that had sparked this whole ordeal. It sat there, still as a reminder of the betrayal that had taken place. You can't keep lying to yourself, the observer said softly, their voice steady. The truth is, you've hurt people. You've taken something that wasn't yours. And no amount of excuses can change that. The manager's face tightened, but there was something different in his eyes now, something raw. For the first time in the conversation, he didn't seem to be trying to defend himself. Instead, he seemed lost, like someone who had realized the full extent of what they had done but didn't know how to fix it. I don't know how to make this right, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to go back. The observer's gaze softened. It's not going to be easy, but it starts with being honest. And it starts with making things right with the people you've hurt. They deserve better than this. For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. The manager had been exposed, and now the truth was out. There was no going back for him, but that didn't mean there was no chance for redemption. It would be a long road ahead, and the consequences of his actions would be severe. But at least now, he knew the cost of betrayal. I'll tell them, the manager finally said, his voice heavy with defeat. I'll make it right. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The observer nodded, their job done for now. The truth had been revealed, and the path to redemption, while uncertain, had begun. The days that followed the confrontation felt like a blur. Word spread quickly, as it always does, and soon enough, the workers knew the truth. The manager, once the trusted leader of the cafe, was exposed for his greed, his deception, and his betrayal. The workers, those who had looked up to him, who had trusted him to protect their interests, now found themselves grappling with feelings of hurt and anger. They couldn't believe it. How could someone they had worked alongside, someone they had admired, have done something so vile? The fallout was immediate and intense. Tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The workers were angry, confused, and hurt. They had put in long hours, gone above and beyond to keep the cafe running smoothly, only to find that their hard-earned tips had been stolen by the one person who should have had their backs. Some of them were furious, their trust shattered beyond repair. Others were quiet, trying to process the betrayal, unsure of how to feel. But all of them had one thing in common: they were struggling to come to terms with the reality that the person they had trusted had taken advantage of them. The manager, meanwhile, seemed to shrink in on himself. He had been called out, his actions exposed for all to see. But instead of taking responsibility in the way one might expect, he seemed to retreat further into himself, unable to face the workers whose trust he had broken. It wasn't just about the stolen tips anymore, it was about the loss of respect, the damage to relationships, and the complete destruction of the trust that had once existed. The observer watched from the sidelines, seeing how quickly things had fallen apart. They had known the confrontation would lead to consequences, but the scale of the damage still surprised them. The cafe, once a tight-knit community of employees working together, now felt like a battlefield. The workers couldn't look at each other the same way anymore. Some felt betrayed by their peers for not catching on sooner, others were angry with themselves for not speaking up sooner. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion, mistrust, and resentment. But the hardest part was watching the manager. He had gone from being the center of the cafe's world to an outcast, a shadow of his former self. The workers avoided him, speaking in hushed tones when they passed him by. The manager would sometimes try to apologize, but his words felt empty. He had done too much damage for a simple apology to heal the wounds he had caused. Still, there was one worker who had taken it upon herself to speak up. She had been the one who had hidden her tips so nervously that day, the one who had noticed the manager's strange behavior. She had always suspected something wasn't right, but it wasn't until the manager was caught that she found the courage to share her story. She wasn't angry with the manager, not at first. But as the days went by, she realized just how deep the betrayal had run. It wasn't just about the stolen money, it was about the way he had used his position to manipulate and control the staff. And that was something that couldn't be forgiven so easily. The workers were left with a choice: to accept the apology, to let the past go and move forward, or to hold on to their anger, to refuse to trust again. It wasn't an easy decision. Some chose to move forward, willing to give the manager a second chance. But for many, it was too late. The trust had been shattered beyond repair, and the damage couldn't be undone. The observer watched quietly as the cafe slowly began to rebuild, one step at a time. The workers didn't forget, but they learned to move on. They learned that sometimes, even when you do everything right, betrayal can still come from the places you least expect. They learned that loyalty and trust weren't just words, they were actions. And they learned that once they were broken, they would take time to heal. The manager, for his part, tried to make amends. He apologized to each of the workers, offering them whatever compensation he could, but he knew that words were no longer enough. He would have to prove his sincerity through his actions. He started by offering to donate part of his salary to a workers' fund, a gesture that, while appreciated, didn't erase the hurt. The workers weren't sure they could ever trust him again, but they couldn't deny that he was trying. In the end, the cafe wasn't the same. The workers had learned hard lessons, and the manager had learned a harsh one. But the observer knew that this was part of the journey. There would be scars, but there would also be growth. And if anything, the truth had come to light, and the path toward healing had begun. As the weeks passed, the cafe began to recover. The wounds, though still fresh, started to heal, slowly, but steadily. The workers, though scarred by the betrayal, found a way to move forward. They knew it would take time, but they also knew that they couldn't stay in the past. The cafe had always been their place of work, their community, and they weren't willing to let one man's actions destroy everything they had built together. The manager, for his part, seemed to genuinely be trying to make amends. He continued to apologize, his attempts at redemption quiet but consistent. He spent more time working alongside the staff, helping where he could, and even took on extra shifts to make up for his past mistakes. But it wasn't just about working harder, it was about proving to the staff that he could be trusted again. And though it wasn't easy, the manager showed real humility. There were no more empty promises or excuses. He had done his part, and now it was time for him to rebuild the trust he had broken. For the workers, the decision to accept the manager's efforts was a delicate one. Some of them were willing to give him another chance, to believe that people could change. Others, however, weren't so sure. They didn't know if they could ever look at him the same way. But as the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere in the cafe shifted. The tension that had once been so thick was slowly replaced by something else, a sense of possibility. The workers were beginning to see that, while the manager's actions had caused deep hurt, he was trying to make things right. And in time, some of them found it in their hearts to forgive him. There was still a long road ahead. The workers, though they had begun to move past the betrayal, would never forget the damage it had caused. The trust that had been broken could never be fully restored, but the cafe was learning how to function again. They were learning how to work together, how to be a team again. And that, in itself, was a small victory. The observer had been quietly watching everything unfold from the background, knowing that their role in the story was almost complete. They had been the catalyst, the one who had exposed the truth. But now, the real work was up to the cafe's employees and manager. The observer knew that the lessons learned here would stay with them all for a long time. One afternoon, as the cafe was quieter than usual, the manager called a meeting. It wasn't just a typical check-in, it was his way of acknowledging what had happened and offering his gratitude to the workers who had stuck by him, even after everything that had come to light. "I know that I've hurt many of you," the manager began, his voice sincere. "And I know that I can never fully make up for what I've done. But I want you to know that I'm committed to making this right. I'm here to work with you, not over you. I know that the trust we had is damaged, but I'm willing to put in the work to rebuild it. I owe you all that much." There was a pause, a quiet moment where the workers exchanged glances. Some nodded, others stayed silent. But the atmosphere in the room was different. It wasn't about the mistakes of the past anymore. It was about the future, about what they could build together moving forward. The meeting ended on a hopeful note, and though the scars of the past were still there, they no longer defined the cafe. The workers and the manager were starting to understand each other better. There was a new sense of respect, one that had been hard-earned through honesty, hard work, and the painful process of confronting the truth. The road to redemption was long, but it had begun, and that was enough for now. The observer, standing just outside the cafe, watched the scene unfold. They knew that this was the way forward, the painful but necessary journey of redemption, forgiveness, and rebuilding. The lessons learned from the manager's mistakes, from the workers' resilience, and from the painful truths that had been revealed were profound. They were lessons not just about trust, but about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. The cafe would never be the same, but perhaps that was the point. In the aftermath of betrayal, there was an opportunity for something better, something stronger. The workers and the manager had learned the hard way, but they were emerging from the darkness with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever the future held together. As time passed, the cafe's atmosphere continued to evolve. The workers were no longer weighed down by the bitterness of the past, though the memory of what had happened still lingered. The manager's journey of redemption was slow, and not everyone was quick to forgive him, but there was a shift, a gradual movement toward understanding. The lessons learned were clear, but they weren't easy. The workers had learned that trust was fragile, that it could be broken in an instant and would take far longer to rebuild. They had learned that loyalty and honesty weren't just words, they were actions, demonstrated every day through hard work and integrity. And perhaps most importantly, they had learned that it was okay to stand up for themselves, to speak out when something wasn't right. In the past, they had quietly accepted the way things were, trusting that the manager would always have their best interests at heart. But now, they understood the importance of questioning authority, of standing firm when they felt something was wrong. It was a hard lesson, but it was one that would stay with them forever. The manager, too, had learned. His journey of redemption had been filled with self-reflection and humility. He had come to understand the true meaning of leadership, not as someone who commands, but as someone who listens and earns the trust of those they lead. He had once seen his position as one of power, as an opportunity to take what he wanted, but the events that had unfolded had shown him the devastating consequences of that mindset. The manager now understood that real leadership wasn't about taking, it was about giving. It was about caring for the people who relied on you, about showing respect and empathy, not just demanding obedience. The process of earning back the trust of his team wasn't easy, and it would take time, but he had committed himself to the work, and that, at least, was a start. One afternoon, after the cafe had closed for the day, the workers gathered around the break table. The usual chatter had quieted down, and there was a sense of calm that had settled over the place. It was no longer the tense, fractured environment it had once been. There was a sense of unity, of shared purpose. The workers spoke openly, no longer hiding their feelings. Some had forgiven the manager, others still held on to the hurt, but there was a mutual respect in the air, a recognition that they had all been through something together and come out stronger for it. The manager joined them at the table, not as a superior, but as one of them. He thanked the workers for their patience, for their willingness to give him a chance, however small. It wasn't just about apologizing, it was about acknowledging the hurt he had caused and showing through his actions that he was ready to be better. "I know I can never undo what I've done," he said quietly, looking around the table at each of them. "But I'm committed to earning back your trust, to being the kind of leader you deserve. And I'll work every day to prove it." The workers exchanged looks, some nodding, others still uncertain. But there was a sense of closure in the room. They had faced the truth, they had dealt with the fallout, and now they were ready to move forward, together. As the evening came to a close, the manager stood up and turned toward the door. He paused for a moment, then spoke again, his voice steady and resolute. "Let this be a reminder that no matter how hard things get, no matter how deep the betrayal, we always have the chance to make things right. It's never too late to change, to do better, to rebuild what's broken. And that's something worth holding on to." The cafe had come a long way from the moment the truth was revealed. The workers had learned a powerful lesson about trust, leadership, and the importance of standing up for what was right. And while they knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, they also knew that they were stronger for having faced this challenge together. The life lesson from this story wasn't just about catching a thief, it was about growth, forgiveness, and the power of redemption. No matter how far someone falls, there's always the chance for them to rise again. The key lies in taking responsibility, being willing to change, and never giving up on the people you care about. And for the cafe's workers, it was clear, they had come through something difficult, but they had come out better for it. They were no longer just a team working together, they were a family, bound by trust, respect, and the shared understanding that no matter what happened, they would always have each other's backs.